Hi, everyone. Before the episode starts, I want to let you know that in between seasons 1 and 2, I migrated my blog and podcast to Substack rather than paying for two separate hosting sites. Substack is now where you can get the show notes and sources, the pictures and screenshots I talk about, and all kinds of extra recommendations and writing on science and pop culture that I post. More importantly, if you like listening to this podcast and want to support me in my quest to bring knowledge of infectious diseases to people without a background in science, a paid subscription will do just that. On Substack, it costs as little as $2.50 Canadian a month, or if you prefer Patreon, you can become a patron for just $2 a month, and that's something you can just set up and forget about for 15 months. If you subscribe on either platform, you'll get access to future bonus episodes and future Q&A sessions that I plan on doing to answer questions about the episodes or infectious diseases in general that people submit to me. You can check it all out on Substack at Tierah Ruins Things, or you can find the links in the show notes. And now here's the episode. Hello, and welcome to Season 2 of Tierah Ruins Things with Science. I am here once again for another season of ruining your favorite movies and TV shows that mention infectious diseases by comparing them with the actual science. I have a degree in immunology, a master's in medical science, and I love watching movies and TV shows, so I combine them into this podcast. This season is going to be all about real infectious diseases that have had a huge global impact, things that have changed the face of the planet or human history in some way. I will be sticking with the format of 6 episodes per season, so that means I might exclude something that you might think I should cover. There are far more than 6 infectious diseases that have fucked with humanity in world-changing ways. But don't worry, I have many more seasons planned around different themes, so I will probably cover the thing that you're thinking of in a later season if I didn't get to it this one. Today, for episode 1, I am covering typhus and typhoid fever. I am doing them together because they have been confused for each other for centuries, even now that we definitively know they're caused by different organisms and are different diseases. Typhus has personally caused millions of deaths worldwide throughout history. Prior to antibiotics, typhus was present in every war, every workhouse, every prison, every concentration camp, or confined space where people did not have access to hygiene. There are mass graves for people who died of typhus during World War II while in a concentration camp, the most well-known of which was Anne Frank. Not so fun fact, that's still the case today, even though we have antibiotics and can cure it. Typhoid fever, very similar. In the American Civil War, more soldiers are said to have died from infections like typhoid or dysentery than from actual combat wounds. And let's not forget about Mary Mallon, famously known as Typhoid Mary. These are 2 diseases that have helped shape the course of human history by the sheer numbers of people they've killed and continue to kill to this day. For typhus, I'm going to talk about an episode of Little House on the Prairie. That is Season 1, Episode 18. And for typhoid, it's Season 3, Episodes 9 and 10 of Outlander. Little House is on Amazon Prime and Apple TV, while Outlander is on Netflix and, all of your regular rental services.
It's about my boy. He's down with the fever. He's had it a couple days now.
So, typhus, typhoid, what are they caused by? Why are they named so similar? I'm going to cover typhus first. There are 2 relevant kinds here. One is epidemic typhus and one is endemic typhus. Epidemic typhus is much more serious. It has a mortality rate of up to 30% if untreated and is considered to be a pathogen that could be turned into a biological weapon, so the CDC has it on a watch list. Endemic typhus is much more mild, people rarely die of it, and it's not considered an illness of great concern. Endemic is a word you might be familiar with. It just means naturally occurring in an area, but doesn't usually spread much beyond that area. Endemic diseases can be either mild or severe. It doesn't necessarily mean we shouldn't be concerned about it. It just means it does not, or has not yet, spread beyond certain areas. Polar bears are endemic to the northern parts of Canada. Malaria is endemic to tropical parts of Africa, and gun violence is endemic to the United States. All things we should be concerned about, but hopefully aren't going to take over the whole world. Epidemic typhus is caused by a bacteria called Rickettsia prowazekii, which is transmitted by human body lice, which are a different species than head lice. You cannot naturally catch typhus from head lice, only body lice. One group that studied this says that it's likely because even though head and body lice are technically the same species, head lice have just a little bit better of an immune system. When head lice are infected with typhus in a lab, they fight off the bacteria much faster, whereas the body lice, they're not great at it, so they're still filled with the bacteria when they bite you. In the show, Charles Ingalls does actually say that you catch typhus from fleas.
How do you get typhus, Pa?
Get it from fleas.
Endemic typhus is also called murine typhus, and it is spread by Rickettsia typhi, the sibling bacteria of epidemic typhus. Murine means to do with mice or rats, and it is called this because it is spread by our dear friend of the podcast, the rat flea, Xenocilla chiopus, who you met before in Season 1, Episode 4 about the Black Death, because it's the same little guy that transmits the bubonic plague. So it seems that on the show, they're asserting that it's murine typhus and not epidemic typhus. In this episode and the show as a whole, I try to stay away from using too many scientific names. I want this all to be as accessible as possible to people who aren't microbiologists. So I'm just going to call these two forms of typhus epidemic typhus and either mild or murine typhus, just to make it a little easier to follow. There's also something called scrub typhus, but that is spread by a different bug and a different bacteria, and I'm not going to talk about it except to say that it is similar to the other typhuses, but it usually causes swollen lymph nodes, and that's not what we see in this episode, so I'm just going to leave it out. Contrast this to typhoid fever. Typhoid is caused by the bacteria Salmonella typhi, which is transmitted not by a flea or bug, but by the good old fecal oral route when you consume contaminated food or water. It's named typhoid because it means like typhus, and typhus was named first. Typhoid is sort of like typhus, and I will talk about that later. When I first learned about typhus and what it was caused by, I wondered if the rickettsia in the name was related to the condition rickets, or maybe named by the same dude. Short answer is no, they're not. The longer answer is that rickets is caused by a vitamin D and calcium deficiency mainly, but there are a few genetic conditions that can cause it too. Rickets has been identified since the 1st century CE, so we really only have speculation on where its name comes from. The term rickets, it probably did come from the German word ricken, with a W, meaning twisted, due to the main sign of the disease. Lack of vitamin D means you end up with soft or weak bones, and that results in a bow-legged stance. Children with rickets are usually smaller than average for age, and sometimes they have other bone abnormalities too. It's not infectious, and it can be treated and prevented by having vitamins and proper nutrition, which is why it's mainly seen in low-income areas where people don't have affordable access to healthy, nutritious food. Notice that I did not say developing nations there, because it absolutely can and does happen in Canada and the US, in places where people live in food deserts and in poverty where they don't have access to good food. Shame on the billionaires for allowing that to happen, and on governments for allowing billionaires to exist while poverty remains unsolved. That is going to be a theme of this episode, though, poverty being a factor in how severe disease is. Rickettsia prowazekii, the bacteria, is named for two men who worked on figuring out what caused typhus, and both of them actually lost their lives to typhus while finding this out. Their names were Howard Ricketts and Stanislaus von Prowazek, and this happened in the 1910s. The name typhus and the name typhi, part of the bacterial name, comes from the Greek word for smoke, typhos, which refers to the feverish delirium that you experience when you catch one of these. Typhus was named first, obviously, hundreds of years before typhoid was officially named, but both of them cause this confused, delirious state, which is probably why they were confused for each other for a long time.
I'm not positive, but I think it's typhus.
The history of typhus is written in those dark pages of the world's story which tell of the grievous visitations of mankind by war, famine, and misery of every kind. In every age, as far back as the historical inquirer can follow the disease at all, typhus is met with in association with the saddest misfortunes of the populace. This is from Volume 1 of a 3-volume work that August Hirsch published in 1883 called Geographical and Historical Pathology, and that set of books has gone right to the top of my wish list for old books about science that I collect. It was written right in the middle of the debate between whether or not diseases spontaneously occurred in people or whether they were infectious and could be spread by some invisible factor or poison. You might think that after things like the Black Death and smallpox, people would have understood that infectious diseases spread person to person, but just keep in mind that a lot of people thought the plague and sickness existed because people were sinners, or that witches were casting spells on people and poisoning water sources, or that you could get sick just from smelling something gross. This is the time period in which Little House on the Prairie takes place. It was interesting to read all the stacks of evidence that Hirsch lines up to prove that typhus is a contagious infection, including a quote from one of his colleagues, a guy named Davies, who said, "I would as soon believe in the spontaneous generation of human beings as I would in the spontaneous generation of typhus." Hirsch describes that, with the exception of plague and relapsing fever, aka malaria, quote, "None of the acute infective diseases has been so closely associated with definite nuisances that have arisen out of a miserable hygiene. None stands in its genesis so directly under the influence of this factor." That was proven in 1909 by Charles Nicolle at the Pasteur Institute, who showed that if you bathed and gave clean clothes to typhus patients when you admitted them, they were no longer able to transmit the disease to others. He received the Nobel Prize for this in 1928. Good for him. Maybe we should be handing out some more Nobel Prizes for treating sick and poor people with common decency and dignity. It's hard to know when typhus first began infecting humans, but considering it's a disease of crowded, unsanitary conditions, it probably started happening shortly after we started gathering in large groups in cities, being crowded and unsanitary. Body lice have been with humans for millions of years, which is long before we were actually humans. They are only transmitted from person to person in very close contact. This allows for it to become a very big problem very quickly when people are shoved together out of necessity or confinement. All species of lice are extremely host specific. They are not promiscuous and they don't parasitize multiple different species of different animals. Every animal will have its own lice species. Human lice are different than dog lice, which are different than squirrel lice. The lice that infect humans are even specific to what part of the body they like to live on. I've mentioned body lice and head lice. Humans have a third louse buddy, and that is pubic lice. They're also known as crabs, but they don't harbor any diseases as far as I know. Lice are small wingless insects that cannot hop or fly, they can only crawl. So when you're crammed tightly into spaces like sharing a bed because your family only has one, or being crammed into a prison cell with 20 other people, or being unhoused and sleeping 10 people to a tent or other makeshift structure, these are scenarios that facilitate the spread of lice and are completely preventable by providing people with adequate housing and shelter, as our pal Charles Nicolle proved. So lice feed on blood through biting you. They will feed 5 or 6 times a day, and they will live anywhere from 4 to 12 weeks. When the louse feeds on someone with an active typhus infection that they got from other lice, the louse will get typhus and they will develop the infection also. The louse ingest the bacteria, which invade the cells lining the louse's gut. They replicate out of control, which causes the cells to burst, and this kills the louse. Humans are the main reservoir of the bacteria that cause the lice to get infected, although I think flying squirrels are currently known to carry Rickettsia typhi, and in the 1950s and 60s, some livestock and farm animals like donkeys were shown to carry it also. Squirrel or donkey lice would not infect humans and pass them the disease, though. So after the louse bites you, its saliva has an anticoagulant and an anesthetic in it, and it backwashes a little bit of that spit into you so that you'll continue to bleed and provide a meal, but you may not feel it. The anticoagulant and anesthetic cause a delayed allergic reaction, making you itchy, and usually you develop a rash after the incubation period of the disease, which is usually anywhere from 10 to 14 days. Then you're going to scratch the itchy rash, you create an open wound, and the scratching rubs the louse feces into it, which is chock full of bacteria that then get into your blood. Yes, the lice poop on you while they feed, and the bacteria is transmitted not by the bite itself, but through the feces being rubbed into the open wound of the bite. This is the same way that murine typhus spreads, only the bug, in that case, that bites you is the rat flea. Body lice are, like I said, actually pretty easy to prevent and cure, although that is much easier said than done. Like Charles Nicole showed, having access to hygiene like showers and baths and having clean clothing and bedding are the easiest ways to stop the spread of lice and thereby typhus. So it's no wonder that throughout known history and currently, the groups of people who still suffer from typhus are the ones without those luxuries. That was sarcasm, just to be clear, because showers or baths and clean clothing should be a human right, not a privilege. So, you get lice, they bite you, they shit, you itch, you get typhus. Or if you're very unlucky, you will inhale dust that has dried louse feces in it, and then you can get infected through the lungs. Epidemic typhus bacteria can survive up to 100 days in dried feces, and that is what makes it a potential bioweapon. It would be relatively easy to drop a bunch of infected dust into an area, people would breathe it in, and then the disease would take its course. That would not make it become a pandemic, though, or spread beyond the vicinity of the area it was dropped, because typhus can't spread person to person. I just mentioned that the incubation period of the disease is 10 to 14 days before you start showing symptoms, so this is the first point against the accuracy of Little House. In the show, they depict people becoming sick within a day or two after infection. That's not correct, but just like old CSI episodes showing that you can sequence an entire genome and find a match to someone's DNA in a few hours instead of days, taking that long probably doesn't make for good TV, so I only deduct half a point for this. When you do get sick, there's a couple days of feeling under the weather and then an abrupt onset of very high fevers. We're talking around 40.5 to 41 degrees C, severe headaches, and you will most likely develop a large patchy red rash on your trunk and your limbs. There will also be tiredness and severe muscle and joint pains all over. Some people might end up with nausea and vomiting or coughing and pneumonia-like symptoms if you were infected by inhaling the dusty shit, essentially. In severe cases, there will be inflammation of the heart and lungs, low platelet counts, and jaundice, which indicates liver damage. I will explain the molecular side of that in a second. They wouldn't have been able to detect the inflammation of the heart or lungs, nor the low platelet counts when the show took place. So basically, your main signs are high fevers, a rash, and aches and pains all over. Just a side note here, I watched the movie Enola Holmes 2, not for this podcast, but just because. And in that movie, Enola is investigating the case of a missing girl who worked at a matchstick factory. The foreman of the factory is inspecting the women and girls who work there for disease, which he calls typhus, but to quote, inspect them, he's looking in their mouths. The movie mentions that this is because there's a current typhus epidemic going on. Now, there are records of a typhus outbreak in England from 1839 to 1842. That is about 40 years before the movie supposedly takes place in 1885. Not that I go to a movie like Enola Holmes 2 for historical accuracy, but besides getting the year of the outbreak wrong, typhus does not affect your mouth. However, that could be part of the mystery of what is actually going on, and I'm not going to spoil that just in case you haven't seen that movie. On Little House, the doctor is confused about what the disease could be until he sees a patient with the rash, and then he knows. And it is at this point that I realize I haven't given you a rundown of what actually happened at the show, so let's do that now. The show opens with some people in Walnut Grove, Minnesota, buying some cornmeal, and the camera closes in on a shot of a rat crawling around on the sacks of cornmeal in the storage shed. Eventually, we see a man come ask Dr. Baker for help. I never watched the show as a kid, so I had no idea that Doc Baker was the king of snark, but his kind of humor would have been right up my alley.
Sorry to bother you.
Nonsense. I'm only in the middle of major surgery.
This makes me kind of want to watch more of Little House, to be honest. The boy's father says his son has a fever and brings Doc Baker to his house. The boy's mother says the kid had a fever for a few days, but then he seemed to get a little better and then rapidly got worse. So the doctor takes the boy over, and here he runs his fingers over some places where you have lymph nodes, like under the chin, the neck, and the armpits. Doesn't appear to find anything out of the ordinary. That's why I say this can't be scrub typhus, because scrub typhus causes swollen lymph nodes. I like that little detail that they put in there. To deal with the super high fevers, the doctor gets some ice and alcohol to cool the boy down by packing him in like a little burrito. The alcohol and ice will make a cooler bath than ice and water or just ice on its own, so that is also a nice little detail that they put in. Then the mother passes out from fever too, and there's an ominous close-up of some bugs crawling on the bag of cornmeal in the corner. It's not super close up enough to tell exactly what the bugs are, but they definitely look to me like they had little wings, which means it's neither lice nor rat fleas, as neither of those insects has wings, like I said. Adult body lice are only 3 to 4 millimeters long, and the rat flea is only 2 to 3. It's like an 1/8 or a 1/16 of an inch or something. So they're visible, but not quite as visible as the bugs show. I'll put some pictures of the bugs on the screen in the show notes and with the transcript, the body louse and the rat flea, and that'll all be on Substack so you can see for yourself what they look like. This might have been a symbolic or stylistic choice. I'm not going to argue with that. It's certainly easier to film a slightly larger insect, and I guess this is what you get when you don't have CGI and are limited to using real bugs as paid actors. Charles Ingalls goes around farm to farm to check on people because it's this whole big wave of everyone getting sick. And he finds a bunch of sick people and he takes them to the doctor, and the doctor sees the rash on the man's abdomen. And that's when shit gets real. The doctor diagnoses typhus, he quarantines the town and tells Charles not to go back to his family, and he gives directions on setting up a field hospital in the church. Then comes what I think is actually kind of a neat little detective story of Charles figuring out how the disease is spread. Quarantining the town is a natural first step, but I think it might have been a little progressive for the time, not completely out of the realm of possibility, but it would have been the experimental, drastic idea of its day. Little House takes place in the 1870s, which is only a few years after Ignaz Semmelweis died in 1865, and Semmelweis was the first guy to be a major supporter of doctors washing their hands after performing autopsies as a way of stopping the spread of childbed fever in hospitals. That did not go well, and maybe I'll tell that story another time. In the mid-1800s, people didn't know about microorganisms, as I said at the beginning. They didn't know that they are what cause contagious disease. They didn't always even agree that diseases were contagious. Often sicknesses were called poisons or toxins, as in August Hirsch's book. He says the typhus poison, or sometimes the virus, not meaning virus as we understand it, but as a Latin word virus, meaning slimy poison. The quarantining in the show doesn't work, unfortunately, because they're positing that the typhus has come from the fleas that are now living in the cornmeal that everyone has in their house. They really got the disease correct. I think they just mismatched the transmission between types of typhus. I do think the townspeople's response to the disease was probably what people would have done. When Charles suddenly realizes why the quarantine isn't working and puts it all together, that it's rats with fleas living in the cornmeal that's causing the illness, he and a couple people go running over to the shed of the guy who's selling the cornmeal. They find the man sick and his cornmeal covered in rats, stuffing their little faces. So they do what's natural and they burn the shed storing the cornmeal down. I'm on the fence as to whether or not that would have worked because rats are made of cartilage, not very much bone, so they're very flexible and can fit through almost any sized hole as long as it's bigger than their head. So I think most of them probably would have escaped the fire. But what is it that makes this wrong? Why is typhus spread by lice really bad and typhus spread by fleas not so much? I have two theories on this. If you remember back to the episode I did on the Black Death, I talked about the rat flea and how they only spread to feed on humans when their preferred meal, the rats, were dead. This is part of why deaths from the plague were higher in rural areas versus cities, because once all the rats died and the fleas went looking for a meal, there were fewer humans on a rural farm, so more fleas per human, and they received a larger dose of the bacteria. The rat flea doesn't like to bite humans if rats are available, so it could be that they only spread typhus to humans accidentally, only when the fleas have nothing else to eat. Whereas epidemic typhus is spread by lice who refuse to live on a different animal and only bite humans, so there is a 100% chance of infection if the louse has typhus itself. The other theory on this took some time to find out. There's a lot of papers out there that talk about epidemic typhus and then mention murine typhus as being milder, but not why. I did eventually find a genetics paper from 2004 that was bold enough to propose that some of the differences in genes they saw between the two bacteria were responsible for the differences in mortality. Since we can cure typhus with good hygiene and antibiotics, there's probably not a lot of money out there to really look into the genetic reasons behind why the two diseases are different. So this group out of the Human Genome Sequencing Center in Texas, they found that epidemic typhus has some extra genes for cellular adhesion that mild typhus does not. It could be that the bacteria causing epidemic typhus is just better at grabbing a hold of the host cell and then invading it, whereas the mild typhus is just swept along by your blood and has a really hard time grabbing onto your cell to invade. Epidemic typhus also has some enzymes that allow it to harvest energy from the host cell just a little bit better than mild typhus. As an intracellular pathogen, something that only lives on the inside of host cells, Rickettsia prowazekii harvests some of its energy from the host cell because it's cheaper to be a mooch than it is to make your own. And in this case, it helps make epidemic typhus just a bit more successful than its more self-reliant sibling, murine typhus. One of the other major changes between the two is that epidemic typhus has an enzyme in the mitochondria that helps produce energy faster. This again allows it to be a bit more like Usain Bolt, and mild typhus without that enzyme is more like me if I try to run 100 meters. I can do it, but not anywhere as fast or as close to, the world record holder can. All of these changes would allow epidemic typhus to cause worse disease. And here's more on what goes on to make the disease bad. What this bacterium does when it gets into your blood vessels from the poop being rubbed into the louse bite, it immediately begins infecting all the cells lining the passages of your blood vessels. It avoids your intracellular defenses, it replicates super fast because it harvests all that energy, and then the cells burst because they're so full of bacteria, and then the bacteria spread to the nearby cells. And it does this everywhere your blood can travel, including crossing the blood-brain barrier, which is normally very good at excluding most pathogens. When these cells that line your blood vessels die, that triggers inflammation and blood clotting. Inflammation causes your vessels to dilate and become leaky, which means swelling as fluid moves from your blood into your tissues. Normally, dilation and allowing blood into tissues is good because it increases blood flow to repair wounds, but only when it's local. When it's everywhere in your body at the same time, that's bad. And, blood clots are just bad all around. They will plug up all the small blood vessels, which causes tissue damage. And if you get bigger clots, they can cause strokes and heart attacks. The tiny burst capillaries and blood vessels in the skin is what causes the blotchy red rash. This is full body tissue damage, and it's what causes the muscle and joint pains and the severe headaches, and the inflammation triggered everywhere at once induces the high abrupt fevers. Without treatment and without access to antibiotics, mortality is between 13 to 30%. That's about 1 in 10 to 1 in 3. If you do survive, recovery to full strength can take months. You're at risk of latent infection recurring at some point in life also from cells that maybe didn't burst and just are harboring some bacteria in them. This latent infection that recurs later in life is called Brill-Zinsser disease, and again, it's named after the two dudes that first described it. Brill-Zinsser is a bit like how people who catch chickenpox are at risk of shingles when they're older, which is just a reactivated chickenpox virus, but this is with a bacteria instead. Sources I found were a bit conflicting in terms of how likely this is. Some said that everyone who gets typhus is at risk of reactivating infection later in life, and some said that only certain people were. So I'm not sure which it is, but basically you'll have some bacteria that find a nice little cell to hide out in, not replicate too much, until at some point later in life, they'll bust out like the Kool-Aid Man and cause disease all over again, even if you don't have lice. In the end, I think the show says 11 people in Walnut Grove died of typhus, which can be a lot in a small community. After it's all over, they clean up the church and then attempt to fumigate it by burning sulfur.
Well, Reverend, that church of yours will smell like rotten eggs for a couple of days.
That would probably work. Sulfur has been used as a pesticide for ages, and since you just burned the pure element, it would have been something people in the 1800s had access to. It's still in use today, in fact. It doesn't harm plants or humans, except burning it does produce sulfur dioxide, which itself is pretty harmful. It's also very harmful to bees, too, so it's not something that people should be doing nowadays, right? Because we need our bees. Fun fact, burning sulfur was also used to disinfect homes after smallpox outbreaks. They would put a pot with sulfur in it in each room of the house. Then they would mix it with a little alcohol and light it on fire. And then they would keep the doors and windows closed for 24 hours, which allowed the sulfur dioxide to work. I say work in quotation marks. I don't know if it actually worked in disinfecting or killing the smallpox virus. The last thing I have to talk about for typhus is actually the first thing I started researching, and that is the question of whether or not it's even realistic for typhus to have been present in the areas of the American Midwest at the time this show took place. Little House the TV show takes place in Walnut Grove, Minnesota from the 1870s to the 1890s. There is an extensive and exhaustive history of the known spread and prevalence of typhus up until the publication of August Hirsch's book in 1883. I've linked that in the show notes if you want to read it. It's pretty cool. It has a lot of other diseases in it. We think typhus was first officially described as a disease in Italy in 1546 by a guy named Fracastoro, who was studying Italian outbreaks. However, even though we have these early descriptions of typhus in Europe, it's not clear whether the disease originated there, or some people say it might have originated in the New World and was brought back to Europe by colonizers. What we do have record of is that by the 1600s and 1700s, typhus was present every time there was a war, which is basically all the time, and scarcely a year went by without a report of somewhere of an outbreak. There was a recorded outbreak in Germany, Austria, and Hungary that went from the end of the 1600s through 1720. 3 severe epidemics in Ireland from about 1710 to 1730 every 10 years, the last of which from 1728 to 1731 affected England and Scotland also. In the last half of the 1700s, there was the 7 Years' War and a war between England and Spain. Forgive me for not going into much detail. I am not a historian. And then through the first part of the 1800s, typhus ripped through France and Napoleon's army. However, after that, it sort of quieted down a little bit, but because Ireland was very poor and they were colonized by England, in the mid-1800s, there was also the Great Famine, resulting in widespread poverty and death. They were still experiencing outbreaks of typhus among this. Many Irish people had fled and emigrated to other countries, and if they had typhus and lice, they took it with them and spread it. So after then, outbreaks of the disease were pretty much blamed entirely on Irish immigrants because the common thinking of the day held that Irish people were inherently dirty, miserable, and just didn't know how to keep themselves clean, rather than that they were oppressed and colonized and kept in poverty on purpose. Even though Hirsch goes on to describe how Russia was at the time suffering greatly from the disease, and that Germany and Austria and other places were also experiencing isolated outbreaks and epidemics through the 1800s, Hirsch and his contemporaries blamed everything on Irish people. He says, "Thus we find that typhus has been repeatedly imported since 1820 into Canada, where the cities of Quebec and Montreal, lying directly on the track of immigration, have suffered most. From time to time, it is true, the disease has traveled along the banks of the St. Lawrence into the interior, but it has not become widely diffused therein. From Halifax, Nova Scotia also, there is an account of importation of typhus by Irish immigrants in 1827, and of the sickness spreading among the inhabitants of the town itself." He lists a ton of outbreaks in Boston, New York, Philadelphia, Baltimore, Hartford, New Orleans, all up and down the East Coast, and closing this section with, "On the other hand, it is a noteworthy fact that the most careful search among the plentiful epidemiological records in the literature of the United States fails to discover a single statement as to the occurrence of typhus in the Mississippi Valley or in the western states, so that the greater part of the continent appears to enjoy absolute immunity from the disease." Being Canadian, I would feel remiss if I did not dwell just a few minutes on that mention of Canada there. I would have loved for The Secret Life of Canada to have done a more in-depth episode on this because they truly know how to dig up hidden or forgotten Canadian history, but unfortunately they've just ended their run, so here's my brief attempt at it. In the St. Lawrence River near Quebec City sits a little island called Grosse Île, and in the 1800s and before, this was one of the main stops for immigration ships coming to Canada, as this was where they served their quarantine period. Canada wasn't Canada yet. That happened in 1867, and in the 1840s, Quebec was called Canada East. At the peak of the Irish famine in 1847, 100,000 people came to Canada in a single season, all passing through this island. Thousands of people died on the crossing, which took about 6 weeks, and thousands more died once they reached Grosse Île and were quarantined. And it wasn't just from typhus. There was typhoid, smallpox, cholera, tuberculosis, measles, everything. Some ships were called coffin ships due to the scale of death that occurred during the crossing. There is now a memorial on the island to the thousands of people who fled famine only to die at the hands of disease. Hirsch and his colleagues, they may have been technically correct that typhus was being spread by Irish people, but they were wrong in why they thought so. They attributed it to some innate quality or laziness that the Irish people had, that they were too stupid to know hygiene or too lazy to keep themselves clean, rather than understanding that the English kept the Irish subjugated and continued to export food from Ireland while people were actively starving to death. Blaming the Irish people for spreading disease is like slapping your little brother with his own arm and saying, "Stop hitting yourself." It misses the point entirely. Typhus was present on the crowded, unsanitary conditions of the ships and continued to be present wherever people were not afforded basic hygiene. This includes jails and prisons, and workhouses and camps. So even if you survived your immigration to the New World, you could still catch typhus from living in poverty there. And as I mentioned at the beginning, it ripped through the concentration camps of the Second World War and was the subject of some human experimentation by the Nazis as well. Anne Frank died of typhus in the Bergen-Belsen concentration camp in February or March of 1945. And in April 1945, Bergen-Belsen was handed over from the Germans to the British. When the Royal Army Medical Corps entered it, they found about 60,000 people being held there, and between 10 to 15,000 corpses in various stages of decomposition just strewn about the camp in various places. Of those 60,000 people, about 3,500 had typhus, and almost all the other 56,500 people were sick with one thing or another, because Bergen-Belsen was apparently one of the camps where sick people from other camps were sent to die. Typhus was so well known to be a problem in the concentration camps that Allies had a specific plan for combating it, involving a stockpile of 450,000 kilograms of DDT. And there were DDT dusting stations set up all along the Rhine to cure people as they were coming out of the camps. Typhus is still an issue today. The largest outbreak since World War II was in the 90s in Burundi, which sparked an extensive epidemic in the refugee camps of that country, as well as Rwanda and the Democratic Republic of the Congo, which at the time was called Zaire. There was an outbreak in Russia in the 90s also, and today Ukraine is suffering quite a bit from the ravages of the disease and from Brill-Zinsser disease because of Holocaust survivors who caught typhus in World War II. Thankfully, now we have antibiotics and treatments for the lice, but in a war-torn nation, the challenges of administering these treatments is no different than if it was still World War II. I imagine that Gaza is in the same situation right now, as well as all the other global conflicts going on in places like Myanmar, Sudan, Ethiopia, and many other African nations. This is not a disease of the past. It is a disease of poverty, and unfortunately, poverty is very much still with us. It's honestly quite horrific. Now, getting back to whether or not typhus could have been present in Little House, as August Hirsch said, there's no record of typhus moving further inland than the areas directly along the East Coast, and even though he's supporting some racist ideas about Irish people, his record keeping and the history of the disease is very detailed, so it's probably correct. And I'm afraid that Minnesota is probably not one of the places where it would have been found. I also think this pokes a big hole in the theory that typhus originated in the New World and was taken back to Europe, because it probably would have been everywhere in the Americas if that were the case, but that's just conjecture on my part. I think it's more likely that the Europeans didn't want to admit that they were the dirty ones covered in lice rather than the peoples who lived in the Americas before they got there. The show should have just stuck with dysentery or smallpox, perhaps, if they wanted a more realistic pathogen that was present all over North America, particularly in the Midwest and on the Oregon Trail. Overall, I think I will give Little House on the Prairie 6 out of 10 Erlenmeyer flasks for their portrayal of typhus.
Of our 400-man crew, 100 have fallen ill and 80 have departed this earth.
All right, let's move on to typhoid as depicted in the TV show Outlander. The full government name of the bacterium that causes typhoid is Salmonella enterica serotype typhi, and I am just going to call it Salmonella typhi for simplicity. A serotype is like a subspecies of an organism. It's a bit like dogs. They're all the same species, but they may have different appearances and traits and talents, but they're genetically similar enough that we call them the same species. It's the same thing with Salmonella. Officially, there are 2 species of Salmonella, Salmonella enterica and Salmonella bongori, but there are over 2,600 serotypes classified based on the sugars and proteins they have on their surface, or what type of motor flagella they have, or what virulence factors they can use. All of these things will change how the bacterium behaves and what kind of disease it causes. Salmonella typhi is one of those varieties, and it's the one that causes typhoid fever. There's also paratyphi A, B, and C serotypes that cause typhoid fever, and non-typhoid causing species Salmonella typhimurium and enteriditis, which if you've ever had regular Salmonella food poisoning, it's probably one of those 2. Salmonella typhi causes disease by giving you diarrhea and then hoping you don't live somewhere with good access to sanitation and hygiene so that you can get it onto the next person via contaminated food and water. Once you are infected, it takes between 1 to 2 weeks to start showing symptoms. It starts off with a flu, like many things do, which is fever, headaches, aches, pains, but then they focus in kind of around your gut, and the main symptoms become nausea, vomiting, diarrhea, cramping, pain, but also sometimes constipation. As the disease progresses, the patients will experience confusion and delirium, which is part of the fevers and why it's mixed up with typhus. However, the exploding gross fluids out of both ends at the same time, that is a pretty big distinction from typhus and should be more or less diagnostic. One of the main things that causes typhus and typhoid to be confused is that typhoid patients can also occasionally develop a light rash. I said that the abdomen rash in typhus is one of the main signs, and it is. It's large red spots all over the trunk and spots that are scabby and raised from itching or louse bites. The rash in typhoid is also called rose spots, and it's much lighter, more sporadic. They go white when you press them. They're not itchy, and there are no bug bites, so there'd be no scratching and no breaking of the skin. I'll post pictures of the 2 in the show notes if you want to see them with the transcript, and again, you can find that on Substack. Typhus patients will show a rash in somewhere between 20 to 60% of cases, while in typhoid, it's between 1 and 30%. I go over this point because in Outlander, one of the main signs that Claire uses to diagnose the illness is a rash. So to sum up the plot point of these 2 episodes of Outlander, if you've never seen Outlander like I never had, Claire is a nurse from the 1940s who magically time travels back to 1740 Scotland and then lives there, bringing her medical knowledge and skills to the people who don't yet know how to wash their hands. Season 3 takes place in 1765 after Claire returned to the 1940s and lived for about 20 years and became a doctor before returning to the past. In episode 9 of season 3, Claire and her husband Jamie watch a young man named Ian get abducted by a ship traveling to Jamaica. I have never watched Outlander, so I don't know who Ian is to Claire and Jamie, sorry, but they end up finding a ship to go after him. On the way, a British warship signals that it wants to board them, and it turns out it's because the British officers need help controlling an illness that is currently ravaging their crew and has killed most of the senior officers. Claire goes aboard the British ship and looks at the sick men. Now, being from the 1960s, Claire would know how to diagnose typhus versus typhoid. The 2 diseases were described first as different in 1739, and in 1760, the term exanthematic typhus was coined, where exanthematic means having a red rash. The true distinction between typhus and typhoid that became widely accepted wasn't until 1836, though, so I can accept that in 1765, as Claire says, the people there wouldn't have known what typhoid was or that it was different from typhus. When Claire examines the men and asks about their symptoms, she does pointedly ask if there's a rash, and then when she hears that yes, they do have a rash, she diagnoses typhoid.
They also have a rash on their stomachs.
Yes. And most of them have the blazing shits.
So here's the thing. Typhoid patients could have a rash, but not commonly, and it would look different than a typhus rash. She could be asking if there was a rash not to distinguish between typhus and typhoid, but between typhoid and literally any other stomach bug or flu, which wouldn't have a rash. I think that's probably the most likely thought process, rather than the writers of the show mixed up typhus and typhoid. I think we can be safe in giving them that credit, since Diana Gabaldon, the writer of the Outlander book and series who writes for the TV show, has degrees in zoology and marine biology and behavioral ecology, so I'll just say the chances are good that this was carefully researched before being written. To that note, typhoid also makes sense as being present on a ship sailing from England to Jamaica at this time, because typhoid was everywhere in the 1700s, particularly England. In order to cure the men, Claire says that they must be bathed, must be moved onto the deck for fresh air, given a liquid diet, and drink only boiled water. She also warns that most of the men will die, which historically would have meant 10 to 30% of people, since the only treatment is a lot of antibiotics, which weren't available in 1765. The trick to curing this on a ship in that year, though, I'd think would be to clean everything well enough and stop reinfecting everyone, which is maybe why Claire says most of them will die, because she understands that. You'd have to bathe the men, wash their clothes, clean their hammocks, clean the decks, clean all the dishes and things they eat with, clean anything they could have touched or that could have been contaminated by the vile amounts of puke and poop spraying out of all of these poor men. The chances of having enough soap and clean boiled water on board are not great, so the typical death toll on these ships may have been more than 30%. It can take as few as 1,000 bacterial cells to cause disease, and although the higher the dose, the faster you get hit with the symptoms. So the tiniest little amount of contamination can start the process all over again.
Every surface must be cleaned. Typhoid fever is spread by hands or food contaminated by infected urine or feces.
Those few little bacterial cells are ingested through contaminated food or water, and they survive the acidic pH of the stomach because they have developed coping mechanisms. Most bacteria can't survive the strongly acidic environment, but Salmonella has a bunch of ways to do this. They have pumps in their cellular membranes that moves the acid back outside the cell wall if it gets inside. They have enzymes that convert the acid to something with a neutral pH. They can also change the fatty acid composition of their membrane to make it more rigid, which makes it harder for the acid to cross the barrier in the first place. And after all that, they upregulate enzymes that repair the damage to DNA and proteins done by the acid from your stomach. There are dozens and dozens of proteins involved in these processes, all of which help them survive long enough to get out of the stomach. Once they reach your small intestine, that's where they begin doing the damage. Now, there are actually 4 different types of this disease. Big difference between having regular food poisoning and having typhoid fever is that in typhoid, the salmonella will invade the cells lining your ileum, which is the last section of your small intestine, and they invade your colon also. Once they breach that barrier, they will invade your lymphatic system and your blood, traveling all over your body and causing multi-organ damage. Normally, we have specialized white blood cells called dendritic cells that hang out in your intestines to help tell the difference between what is food and what is dangerous. And we have other cells called macrophages. They're another white blood cell, and they gobble up all the dangerous stuff. But Salmonella has figured out how to survive inside both of those cells. Salmonella actually disguises itself inside the dendritic cell after it gets gobbled up, and it uses them as sort of a Trojan horse to travel around your body. It does this by secreting all sorts of factors and proteins that change the proteins on the surface of the dendritic cell so that other white blood cells can't tell that it's infected. This allows the salmonella to make its way to your gallbladder, where it sets up shop and invades the cells lining the inside of it. This is apparently made easier if you have gallstones, as 90% of chronic carriers have been shown to have them. This can lead to a long-term carrier state where you may not experience symptoms or be sick, but you can still be actively shedding a ton of infectious bacteria in your poop all the time. The liver can also be a reservoir of salmonella, and it sheds the bacteria into the gallbladder, which secretes it along with bile into your small intestine. The intestinal damage done by the initial invasion results in sores and lesions all over your gut, which are the diagnostic tool used to distinguish typhoid from typhus. That's if all the rampant diarrhea and vomiting wasn't enough of a clue. At least in the 17 and 1800s, that was how they officially diagnosed typhoid. And yeah, it was always post-mortem if they're looking at the inside of your guts. On a ship at sea in the middle of the Atlantic or the Caribbean, the puddles of puke and poop would have to suffice. I mentioned long-term carrier state a minute ago, and you've almost certainly heard of this before, but you probably know it better by its most famous patient, and indeed the first recorded incidence of such a thing being even possible, and that is Typhoid Mary. Typhoid Mary was real. She was born in Ireland in 1869 and emigrated to the US around 1884, where she became employed as a cook in New York. The TV show The Nick actually has 2 episodes on her in the first season. The original report that describes her as a healthy carrier of typhoid was published in 1907, after 6 of the 11 people who lived in the house where she worked became sick with typhoid. During the investigation, it was found that of 7 of 8 families she had previously worked for also experienced outbreaks of typhoid while she was there. Since there was no vaccine for typhoid yet and no antibiotics, the only way they could prevent the spread was to arrest Mary. She apparently led them on this big chase and eluded them for 5 to 6 hours running around the city, but eventually she was captured and she was forced to give stool samples, which then tested positive for salmonella. Her story is a wild one. She was initially released and told not to work as a cook anymore, but sadly she refused to do other domestic work as apparently she didn't believe any of this was her fault. She was eventually forcibly confined on North Brother Island in New York City's East River, where she spent the rest of her days refusing to believe that any of the infections or deaths were her responsibility. In 1907, there were about 3,000 cases of typhoid in New York City, and the paper I found blames Mary for being the cause of most of them. The paper detailing that account is linked in the show notes, as well as a link to the transcription of her own letters, so you can read about how she felt about this whole thing in her own words. It's really an interesting case that raises some ethical questions about confining a person who is making others sick but refuses to stop doing it or submit to treatment that perhaps might be relevant today or maybe like 4 to 5 years ago. Currently, typhoid is a problem across China, the Indian subcontinent, and throughout parts of Africa, all where there are high levels of poverty and low levels of accessible hygiene, sanitation, and hand washing. Almost 60% of Salmonella strains have developed resistance to first-line antibiotics, so this is a matter of huge concern to the planet and makes a vaccine even more important. There are 2 vaccines, one that contains a killed bacteria called typhi, TYPH-I, for inactivated, and typho, O for oral, and that is a live attenuated or weakened bacteria. They both provide about 50% protection, and typhi protection lasts about 3 years, while typho lasts about 7. Bacteria are a lot harder to make good vaccines against than viruses for a lot of complicated reasons that I won't get into here, but mainly it's because the antigens, or the things on the outside of that bacterium that your immune system reacts to, are more often sugars and starches on a bacteria, and your immune system reacts better to proteins, which is what the outside of viruses are. Bacteria can also change the antigens every successive generation, and then, if you develop immunity to one sugar or protein or whatever that's on the outside of it, the next bacteria after it splits will just have a different one. The vaccine isn't usually given out unless someone is traveling in an area where typhoid is endemic, so those parts of the world that I mentioned a moment ago. Obviously, there is a whole other podcast here about Mary Mallon and typhoid vaccines, but those aren't parts of the Outlander episode, so I've given some links if you want some more info on that. And This Podcast Will Kill You probably covers all of that in more detail, so go check them out if you want more. Overall, I will give Outlander 9 out of 10 test tubes for accuracy. They did really well, and they portrayed this disease fairly accurately. Alrighty, that's all I have for this episode of Tierah Ruins Things with Science. I am a researcher, not a doctor, so please don't take any of this as medical advice. It is for entertainment only. You can follow me on Facebook, TikTok, Blue Sky, and Instagram at Tierah Ruins Things. You can find all kinds of things at Tierah Ruins Things on Substacks, like the show notes and transcripts, as I've mentioned, as well as all the other stuff like reading and listening lists. I talk about science books and podcasts that I've been listening to and enjoy. Also on Substack, you can support me ruining things by becoming a paid subscriber, or you can join my Patreon if that platform is more your vibe. I do all the research, writing, and recording, and editing. The new theme song this season was written and provided by iEffigy, and you can follow them on Spotify. There's a link in the show notes. I would like to take this chance to thank everyone in my life who has supported me through the last year, which has been a time rife with change for me. I have tried to release this second season twice before this, and life decided to fuck with me both times. Without the help and love of my family and friends, I wouldn't be here or have been able to make this season of the show. So truly, thank you from the bottom of my heart. I would also like to thank my cat Hella, because she is a perfect angel baby and she is my reason for doing all of this. If you have any suggestions for TV shows or movies featuring diseases or pathogens that you'd like me to cover, send them in to tierahruinsthings@gmail.com or get in touch on any of the social medias that I mentioned. See you all next episode, where I will be talking about the 1918 influenza pandemic as displayed on Downton Abbey.